Welcome back to another episode of How to Become an Obstacle Buster. I'm your host, Warren Wandling, the show that's dedicated to bringing leaders and entrepreneurs strategies, tips, and resources to overcome their obstacles, to build resilience, and achieve success. Hey, if this is your first time listening or you've been part of our community for a while, thank you for tuning in today. Before I introduce you to my guest today, I want to make sure that you're aware of a new resource to help you to be resilient. It's our private Facebook community called Leadership with Purpose. So you can either search in groups in Facebook and search Leadership with Purpose. And I'll also make sure that link is in the show notes as well. In our community, I share strategies, tips, and resources so you can step into less stress, greater profit, and experience the work you love. It's also a great place to connect with other like-minded leaders. So I look forward to seeing you in our community. Our sponsor for the show today is Audible. If you love listening to podcasts, I know you're going to love Audible like I do. It's a great way to be able to listen to books that you want to read this year. So if you're not already subscribed to Audible, let me get you a free book and a free 30-day trial. The book that I recommend is The Compound Effect by Darren Hardy. By simply visiting warrenwandling.com/audible, you can grab your free book and your free 30-day trial to Audible. Again, that's warrenwandling.com/audible. WARRENWANDLING.com/AUDIBLE. I have a great guest with me today, Krister Ungerböck. He is a leadership communication expert, keynote speaker, and former CEO of a global tech company. His work has appeared in NPR, Forbes, Inc., HR.com, Chief Executive, Recruiter.com, and Entrepreneur. Prior to exiting corporate life at the age of 42, Krister was CEO of one of the largest family-owned software companies in the world. Well, welcome to the show, Krister.
I'm happy to be here, Warren.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to our conversation today. As you might know, on How to Become an Obstacle Buster, we provide different strategies, tips, and resources helping leaders and entrepreneurs to overcome their obstacles, build resilience, and achieve success. So to start that conversation today, as a leadership communication expert, keynote speaker, and former CEO of a global tech company, tell us about your business.
Well, sorry, do we want to start over? I had all these beeping things.
No, we're good. I can edit it out.
You can edit it out. Sorry about that. So tell us about your business. So my business, my mission is to change the words of the world. And so I've really moved much more of my effort. I do some keynote speaking. I do a small amount of coaching with senior executives and CEOs of entrepreneurial companies that are scaling, typically companies that are trying to go from 50 employees to 500. But most of my work really is really writing books and, with the intention of really changing the words of the world.
Wow, that's fascinating. I love that around the words of the world. And I know we're going to get into that later in our conversation today. So within working with those clients between the company size, maybe 50 to 500, what is the greatest obstacle or obstacles that your clients encounter?
Well, my experience as a CEO and a leader, so I started with our company when we were about 13 employees, and I retired at age 42 when we were about 250 employees. So I was CEO at that time. And admittedly, the biggest obstacle was me. And for the most part, many of the leaders that I work with, they are the biggest obstacle. They just don't realize it. And specifically, what I found is going from leading teams of kind of 5 people up to 250 people is that roughly, especially leading a team of 5 to 10 people versus 30 people versus 100 people, like our leadership style must change significantly. Like the way I led a company of 250 people with offices in 5 countries was completely different. And in fact, some of the things that may be successful as a leader of a team of 5 when I was early in my career actually caused less success when trying to lead teams over 30 people. So I think that really is this, what makes us successful leading small teams is often what makes us unsuccessful leading large teams.
So that's very fascinating. You said two great, interesting points there. The first one was that typically that you were the greatest obstacle, and typically that's where you find the leader is the one that's the obstacle. Can you explain a little more detail in reference to how you come to that point, in reference to realizing the head or the CEO of the organization might be the one that's stopping the growth?
Well, I think that usually where it starts, what the words I said to myself and the words I hear other leaders in this situation, because it doesn't just apply to CEOs. I mean, there are many people in growth companies that get promoted quickly, especially, I mean, our company grew 3,000%. So we had a lot of leaders that were kind of promoted quickly and their leadership skills hadn't necessarily caught up to what the leadership role they were asked to do. And I think usually it starts with words like, why can't my people, why does it take them so long to do things? Why can't they just get it right the first time? If there were just three of me, then we would get things done so much more quickly. These are the kind of things that are usually symptoms that one's leadership style is actually the problem. And I'm speaking from personal experience. I was saying these things myself before I realized kind of how I had to change my style. So,
yeah, that's very interesting. So sometimes it turns into really sometimes it's the followership, or really is it the leadership? And I think that's what you're making that point, is realizing it's the leadership and the language that they use on themselves in that process.
Yeah, and the language, the words that we use when we lead others. I found one of my most difficult moments, which kind of set me off on writing this book, is I found myself shortly after age 42. I walked out on the CEO job of the company that I helped build and loved. And then 2 weeks later, my wife walked out on me, and I was at the YMCA signing up for a gym membership. And they asked me, who's your emergency contact? And I broke down crying because I had no one. And here I was like, wow, I was this leader of this global company worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and no one wants to follow me. Like, where did I go wrong? I'd read all these business books and been to tons of leadership courses. And yet all the people who are closest to me, I had problems in all these relationships, both in business and at home. And so I went on this journey to like, I got to find out what I did wrong, because I don't want to get married again or start another company and have, all this stress again. And so I set aside all the business books that I'd kind of started reading since I was a teenager, actually. And I went in, hung out with all the people that I would have previously judged as kind of weird or far out when I was a CEO. And that's really my mission, was to kind of take those things I learned there and really translate them into the business world. Because I heard the word universe a lot. But I always kept my CEO practical kind of Midwest business hat on and say, how could this stuff really be used in a corporate environment, and also in parenting and in families? And that was really, for me, was really the unique insight that I had, was this unified language for leading, both in the context of a family or in the context of a team.
Wow, that's interesting. You also mentioned around some of the obstacles was you don't lead a team of 5 as you would lead a team of 30.
Yeah.
So is there a difference of strategy? Is it go back to your thoughts, or is it also a combination of strategy in leading those team sizes?
I think it's really more, so imagine you're a leader of 5 or 10 people, right? So how do we get promoted? We get promoted because we got a lot of the right answers. Often we get 5 times more results than the other 5 people on our team. So we get promoted for that.
Mm-hmm.
The reality is like, you can't carry a team of 100 people on the back of one person, right? So we really need to figure out how to work through others. And what happens is, and what I did myself, is I was trying to solve everyone's problems for me. And many of your leaders probably you get like 200-300 emails in your inbox a day. And like, this is a good signal that like people are just looking to you for the solutions. And that will not scale beyond 30 or 50 people. So if you want your career or your company to scale beyond 30 or 50 people, then we need to develop a completely different way of leading. And that's really about leading more with questions that help others come to the solutions. What happens is, I find, is that both with my own experience and others, people that I coach, is we kind of get like a little dopamine hit, like when we get a solution, right? So it's like, so what we do is almost like get addicted to that, right? Like, oh yeah, I feel great when I give my team the solution. But you know who doesn't feel great when you give your team the solution? Your team. They don't want the solutions. They want to have that dopamine hit themselves to be like, I found the solution, rather than my boss gave me the answer on the test. And so it's a really subtle distinction. And what it is for me, a lot of it was about ego. Like I got so much, I got a lot of personal, let's say, validation of my own kind of self-esteem and like my worth as a leader, both in terms of financial benefit I was providing the organization from giving solutions. And ultimately, I had to let go of that and really let other people kind of take that, that kind of validation of coming up with the solutions. And so it's a very different way of communicating. What my challenge is for many years, I had been to courses and they said, yeah, you have to like let people, come up with their own solutions or ask them the questions. But I never knew how to do it until I wrote this book and said, okay, these are exactly the questions that you can ask to implement these things that you often hear about in courses that they don't tell you exactly how.
Wow, that's fascinating. So what was the key strategy that contributed to your success then building your business?
Well, I don't know. It depends on which business. The business I was in before, a lot of I think we had a great product. That's probably the commonality between my current business. My product is the book ultimately. I think another thing that was really successful for us is we went international. So I actually had part of this book is informed by my own experience learning to lead in French and German as an adult after September 11th. And so, this is also, let's say if we talk about my success in the current business, I would say it just comes down to, I found it very interesting that my previous business was software. So it was like it was B2B, right?
Right.
And B2B is a kind of business that, you win the $1 million deal and it makes your year, right? Whereas B2C, selling books for $19.99 on a website it's a game of inches. Like every single 50 cents, how can I reduce my cost of goods sold? How can I improve the conversion rate? And so it's just like a constant game of just like making things a tiny bit better. Like just 0.1% makes all the difference in this kind of attempting to kind of change the words of the world. So it's really, for me, it's fascinating. I love it. It's I've somehow become a pretty good online marketer. Not because I'm exceptional personally. I've surrounded myself with some of the best people in the world, frankly, in online marketing to kind of coach me along the way. So.
Oh, excellent. So you're known though for achieving remarkable employee engagement levels, like I believe 99.3%.
Yes.
What's your leadership secret there?
Well, I would say probably one of the simplest leadership secrets is it was probably more in spite of my own personal leadership style. I knew that I was not the strongest, kind of most empathetic person while I was CEO. Admittedly, after writing this book, I actually, somewhere like 3 or 4 years later, I actually got feedback. Somebody said, "You're very empathetic. You have great emotional intelligence." And I used to joke with them like, "You should have met me 10 years ago." So in my company, the software company that we grew and had 99.3% employee engagement, a lot of it was having leaders who were much more empathetic around me and recognizing that I was an engineer. I was pretty kind of direct and aggressive. I never yelled or screamed, but I was aggressive in my words without kind of using aggressive tone. So I think that was a big thing. But I also differentiate between, I often talk about the difference between following a vision and following a person. So I believe that in retrospect, we created this company. We did have amazing levels of employee engagement. We won all the top workplace awards, many 5, 6, 7 years in a row. But interestingly, I was the leader at the top while we were winning all those awards, and my style was actually not necessarily the thing that was driving engagement. I wasn't terrible, but certainly compared to what I've learned over the last 5 years since I left that role. And so this thought of, we did all the things like pizza parties and we did employee surveys, all those things. And sometimes I look at what we were leaving on the table. If I had led with the tools that I now have, and we had, I guess we created $100 million in shareholder value when I was CEO, and it would, admittedly, I wouldn't be surprised if it was 300 or $400 million in shareholder value. And frankly, I probably would have, I wouldn't say probably, I would have still been CEO of that company if I knew the skills of communication that I know now, because I wouldn't have had the huge, ultimately fight with my shareholders that resulted in me deciding to leave the organization.
Sure. That's a great insight that you shared in reference to an EI leader having the emotional intelligence and really connected, not just at that first level of being aware that we have emotions, because that's a human element, right? But having that deeper knowledge of how to work within that framework around EI.
Yeah, I used to think, because I was an engineer, I started programming when I was 12 years old, and a lot of people like Steve Jobs and Bill Gates were my idols, and a lot of tech leaders were actually known and almost like idolized for being jerks, frankly. I think that they softened, certainly Bill Gates is not a jerk anymore, but the person he was in the 1980s and 1990s, he was kind of well known and Steve Jobs is also not it's pretty widely known about firing people in elevators. So it's almost like a lot of people in tech actually almost like look up to that, go, that's what makes me successful. But I think separately, a lot of engineers and accountants and people in those kind of more analytical professions are not too dissimilar from me. Like, so I always thought that maybe empathy is just not something that I can't learn it because it's just not my personality. And what I realized on the journey after, trying to find out, and I probably read 10 books on emotional intelligence, and I still thought, well, there's no way I can do this. It's just, I'm an engineer, I'm direct, I'm assertive, just not going to get there. And what I realized is it's actually as simple as changing our words, right? If you want someone to change their words that they speak back to you, it's actually as simple as changing the words we speak to them. And empathy can be boiled down to language. So when I was kind of on the journey looking at all these, like, all these very empathetic people, a lot of therapists and kind of new age people talking about kind of, all kinds of, philosophy kind of things, I just observed the words they used, and I always ran it through this filter of learning French and German, and like I had the fortunate experience of learning French and German in like super accelerated time because I surrounded myself, or I hired some of the best French and German teachers in all of Europe. Obviously we had a big business, so I was like, well, if I can condense the learning process and shave a year off my learning, then it would be worth $50,000 to hire the best coach, right? So I took the lessons of how they helped me to learn French and German quickly and applied it to these talk shifts, which are, tools for leading with more compassion, more empathy, driving more commitment and growth, both in people and in teams and in businesses.
That's very interesting, growth, in which I know we're going to get into the book that you've written here. But I'm really curious before we jump to that question, and you've mentioned this just earlier about the 100 million in shareholder value. I'm curious, how did you create 300,000% and that 100 million in shareholder value?
So it was 3,000%.
3,000%.
Which in and of itself is a bit. So any financial person always says, well, what was your basis? Like, so we started with like $1 million and $1 million and then about 15 people. So it was 3,000% growth off of it's, if it's $1, it's not a very interesting number, but it was actually a pretty good baseline. So I think that ultimately it came down to having a product that was differentiated in the market. I was passionate as CEO and as leader. I considered myself the chief recruiting officer. I found that ultimately, there are two types of kind of leaders, at least at the CEO level. I think they're kind of the sales oriented, or you're a little bit more internal oriented. So because we were a global company, the reality is I couldn't lead sales. I mean, I can't be in Hong Kong and Sydney and London, Paris and New York all at the same time, right? And I had 2 young kids, so that I didn't want to do it personally. So I made the choice to say how I'm going to add value to the organization is in the talent attraction. So I was really essentially the face of the employer brand, and did all the all the strategic recruiting. And ultimately, I was a product-oriented CEO. And so, what I found is all of the major turning points in our business, I could actually point to the specific individual that we hired that created that. And so that for me is ultimately the growth. You can be an amazing leader, you can be an amazing product person, and you could probably get your business to 20 or your team to 25 or 30 people working 60, 80 hours a week. But if you want to go beyond that, then I believe you must become amazing at retaining and recruiting the best talent. My experience has been that the people who are good at what they do and the people who are the top 5% of what they do, the people in the top 5% are the people that literally within 3 to 5 days after they start with the business, they're already adding value. And the other people who are very good, sometimes it's kind of like you start to see results within like a month or two. But the ones, and admittedly, I think there's probably only about 7 people in my entire career that I've hired, including the person who's currently the CEO of the company, who I hired to take over the company after I left. Those individuals, that's what builds great team and great companies, is being able to hire the person who can replace you, so that you can go on. My philosophy was always, if I can hire the person who can do the job that I'm currently doing. In my case, it was like, if I can hire the person who can run the company of the size we are today, then that frees me up to go double or triple the size of the company over the next 3 to 5 years. And that was always my philosophy from the very early days when I joined the company.
So as the author of 22 Talk Shifts, Tools to Transform Leadership into Business, in Partnership and Life, what inspired you to write the book?
I wanted to write a book that was more than business. I wanted to write a book for people like myself who are business leaders looking for tools that would help them be better leaders and more successful in their careers and financially. But I also wanted to write a book that would help them to avoid the situation that I had of getting divorced after having an amazing financial success in business, getting divorced unexpectedly because we didn't really realize how our words were not really translating well into our home life. And so that was really my intention with writing the book and doing all the research for 5 years, was what's this unified language that will allow especially men to give them new words that will work equally well in leading a family as well as leading a team or leading a business. And that's ultimately what Talk Shifts is all about. It's a book for leadership in business, but it's also a book for leadership in the context of any relationship.
So what do leaders need to know about Talk Shifts to increase emotional intelligence, connection, and commitment then?
Well, there are three out of the 22 Talk Shifts are specifically around emotional intelligence. The others kind of dance around it. They're about creating commitment and connection. But around emotional intelligence, I think the biggest one for business leaders really gets around anger. As a leader myself and all the leaders that I coach, the most common emotion that I see demonstrated in the workplace is anger. And anger is just a family of emotions. So there are frustration, disappointment. These are just kind of siblings of anger, right? The softer forms of anger. And so I'm not talking about yelling and screaming anger here. I'm just talking about that kind of frustration, like passive aggressive sometimes is where it comes out. Like, why did you do that? And so, but what I found in the journey is that, and any psychologist or family therapist will tell you, is that beneath anger is often a deeper emotion that we can use to connect. It's usually fear. In a workplace, it's often fear or embarrassment. Sometimes it's guilt. But if I understand whenever I'm angry, whether it's with a family member or a team member at work, I say, okay, anger is just a warning signal. What's the real emotion behind this? And it's usually the best way to ask it is a multiple choice question. This is Talk Shift, I think, number 19. But am I experiencing fear, shame, which embarrassment is a softer word for that, guilt, and you just pick between those three. And then Often it's fear. Like I'm afraid, I'm angry that somebody turned in some bad work. And then I'm afraid that I'm going to lose my job, or we're going to lose a big client, or we're not going to be able to give big raises and bonuses at the end of the year because somebody's not doing quality work. And so now I can have a conversation on that emotion that's behind the anger. And the difference is that when I have a conversation based on my anger, like, hey, get this done immediately, get it done tomorrow, what happens is anger disconnects us from others. But when we talk about the fear or the shame or embarrassment or whatever that same situation created, now we can create connection. If you're an employee and you work for me and I say, hey, I'm afraid that we're not going to be able to give those big bonuses that we gave last year if we lose this client, or we continue to provide proposals with this, typos or whatever it may be. Mm-hmm. And assuming that the person who works for me doesn't really dislike me and want me to be embarrassed and afraid, that's a whole separate issue. Like we must have a pattern of, but assuming they actually want me to not be afraid, then they'll be much more interested and connected in terms of trying to resolve that.
Yeah, that's really fascinating.
But the other thing that happens is when we as leaders come in with anger or disappointment or frustration, is we often underestimate how much fear that creates in the people who work for us. And the neuroscience is very clear that when people are in a state of fear, the part of their brain responsible for creative thought and things that we want those employees to do to solve the problem actually shuts down. So when I say I'm frustrated, or you can feel the frustration in my voice, employees naturally, even if they're fairly secure in their jobs, many of them are like, am I going to lose my job? Am I going to and so we're actually putting them mentally in a state where they're unlikely to do their best work right when we need them to do their best work.
Yeah, that's really fascinating around neuroscience of how the brain operates and putting that fight or flight perspective, and how the brain doesn't really, and then it can't process or think or be creative. And certainly if they're not self-aware that they're in that state, of how to get out of it quickly.
Yeah. And that's part of our job as leaders. If we want to get the best work out of our people, then we want to keep them out of the state where their brains are not actually able to do their best work.
Right. Which is fascinating, right? So from a leadership perspective, that's where you create leverage, and building those strong teams to be able to function so they can then lead their teams also.
Absolutely.
So what authors have influenced you over the course of your career? You said, obviously you did a research with 5 years before you wrote your book. What are some books that you could recommend?
So I would say the two people who influenced the most would be Ryan Holiday's. I mean, if you're talking about writing your own book, Ryan Holiday wrote a book called Perennial Seller, which was it's actually a great way of thinking about any new product, book or otherwise. And then the person who helped me most, my editor is an amazing woman who's been behind 100 or more New York Times bestsellers. And then Neil Strauss, best-selling author and Rolling Stone's journalist, Neil Strauss has been my writing coach. And admittedly, between those three people, actually, I don't know Ryan Holiday, I just read his book, but between my editor and Neil Strauss, that's really been what shaped this book to what it was. I wrote it and rewrote it 4 times. And,
oh, wow.
And so the reason it's, kind of, I think we broke into the top 25 in leadership books on Amazon last week. And it's one of the only books that's actually #1 in fatherhood and in communication and management and organizational change, IT project management, and parenting teenagers of all things. So
I see the parallels.
We were able to do exactly what I set out to, which was to create a book that actually could sit on both the kind of relationship and parenting shelf, as well as be equally powerful as a business leadership book. And that was the intention that we set out to do 5 years ago, or that I set out to do 5 years ago.
Wow, that's an interesting parallel, really, because raising like teenagers, just as a leader, it's easier to say do the action and demand it because you think you deserve that respect, instead of having relationship and asking questions to have them draw to the conclusion of what's the right decision to make.
Yeah, I find this with my kids are just starting to kind of get into the tween phase, and I have two stepchildren that are teenagers. And admittedly, if we, as leaders, we have power over people in business, right? So that people have to do what we do.
Right.
At some level, people have to do what we tell them to. But if we actually think about the concept of getting our adult children or teenagers, if we can, many of the same tools of getting them, because they actually really need to want to do it, right? Well, if you can use the same words and techniques, and that's what the book is fundamentally about, and Talk Shifts is fundamentally about, is here's the techniques that would work with adult children and teenagers or spouses to get people to want to do things. Well, if you have tools that help people to want to do things, imagine how much more productive your employees are, right?
Mm-hmm.
Rather than just telling them, and I've heard stories from people who are reading, and there's a million people have seen one of the ads for the book, and there's always comments on there. There's one woman who's commenting just the other day. She's like, I had this boss and he asked me to work, an extra 4 hours a week. And I just did everything I could I didn't even work 32 hours a week. And then I had a new boss who asked me to work 50 hours a week, and I do it happily. So the same person, and I've heard so many stories of people who were like, I just didn't like my leader. So one guy was in my basement. I was interviewing these old guys who were the construction crew who's renovating my basement. And one guy told a story. He said, I wish I'd had these tools 30 years ago when I was running like the repair shop at this auto dealer, because I would tell people to do stuff and they literally would lay down on the shop floor because they wanted me to get fired.
Yeah, isn't that amazing? That's a great story. I mean, that's probably another episode in itself in reference to just that one tweak, right? In reference from a leadership perspective.
Yeah.
So what does the future hold for you? Any special projects?
The thing I'm most excited about is this, two things that are related. We're doing the first, the book that's already released, 22 Talk Shifts, is actually the first ever book that will be continuously updated like software. So I used to be a software CEO. So when I was rewriting the book 4 times over, I was like, why can't books be more like software? They just constantly get better. Every 6 months or every year, there's a new edition. So imagine if you have 30,000 books sitting in warehouses around the world, it's kind of hard to update those in real time. So we pioneered this new thing called Talk Shift TV, which is actually launching. It just launched on Fire TV. Well, we're in February now. So by the time this airs, it'll be on Fire TV, Roku, Apple, Android, iOS. So you basically, any device you want, you can actually watch the book. So the book was partly written for video. And the reason for that is that these talk shifts they're specific phrases that you can use to speak to someone. And one of the things that's so powerful is that when you actually experience it on video, you don't just hear these phrases or read them in a book and think about them. You actually feel what it's like to have someone look you in the eye on your television or on your mobile phone, but have me looking you in the eye and actually speaking to you using the talk shifts. And it is so much different to sit with your teenage children or your adult children or your spouse on the couch and actually feel what it's like to be spoken to using this new way of speaking. And like that for me is like, I think it's, I'm getting initial feedback from people that it's like revolutionary. People watch a chapter together and then they talk about it as a family. I didn't build the Talk Shift TV really for the business audience. It's really for people to pop some popcorn, pop it on your television, and start talking about the words that we use to communicate with one another. And then what I find is that some people in those families, if they are career oriented and they are entrepreneurs, they're probably going to practice those tools both in their business life and in their home life. Some people choose just one area of their lives to start with. But so this Talk Shift TV concept is really, that's really the thing that's most powerful. And then down the road, the other thing that's important about this is I just started my second book and we're going to actually release the book. People will on Talk Shift TV will actually be able to watch the book unfold as it's being written. So we're actually going to release the book onto Talk Shift TV first, get feedback from the audience, allow people to ask questions, tell me what's working, what's not, and then we're going to take that feedback and then we're going to turn it into the book that will change the words of the world.
Oh, that's awesome. That is revolutionary in reference to instead of the same old way with books, taking it to the next level from like a software. I love that. I love that idea.
Thank you. I've been trying to figure it out for 5 years. Fortunately, I finally found the right partner about 3 months ago.
That's awesome. So if I know our listeners want to be able to connect with you, what are the best ways for them to be able to do just that?
Best way is to go to talkshift.com and grab the book. You can also go to, if you're on Facebook, you can go to 22 Talk Shift. There's a private Facebook group for people who purchase the book to ask questions. That's one of the places we'll be streaming some of the limited edition content. But the best place to go is to talkshift.com. When you buy the book, there's a special offer that will allow you to get access to TalkShift TV for significantly lower than if you download it or try to do it from your Roku or Fire TV device or whatever.
Well, excellent. Well, I appreciate Krister sharing all your strategies, tips, and resources for us this afternoon.
Thank you. It was a fun conversation. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, I really enjoyed the conversation as well. Well, until next time, this is your host, Warren Wandling, saying, be resilient